Hello and a warm welcome to the South Asian Literature and Art Festival, or SALA as it is popularly known, proudly produced by Art Forum San Francisco. This festival is special because of you, because you chose to be here to listen and to celebrate South Asian voices. A heartfelt thank you to all of our sponsors for making this literature and art festival a reality. Their dedication to supporting writers, artists, and exchange of ideas keeps creativity alive in our community. Quick housekeeping rules. Please silence your phones and no recordings. Everything will be on YouTube so you can relive the brilliance at your own pace. Also, please make sure that you do not leave any belongings or water bottles behind. There will be a 15-minute Q&A session followed by book signing by the author in the Florence Moore courtyard by the bookstore. And lastly, as a volunteer-run organization, we at SALA are deeply grateful to all our volunteers without whose support none of this would be possible. So let's dive in, open our hearts and minds, and enjoy the stories that remind us how art connects us all. The topic of today's discussion is Unpacking Stories, South Asian Art in Our Lives, in which our keynote speakers, Padma Dorje Maitland, Nidhi Gandhi, and Tausif Noor, are in conversation with Sonia Dami. Sonia Dami is an innovative curator and cultural advocate for Sikh art and heritage. She has curated 2 landmark exhibitions that have contributed to the evolving discourse on Sikh art. Dami led multiple art initiatives at the Sikh Foundation, including the Sikh Gallery at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts and exhibitions at museums. As president of Art and Tolerance Inc., she promotes inclusivity through her art. She also serves as a trustee of the Sikh Foundation. Recognized with multiple awards, Dami is dedicated to enhancing Sikh culture, cultural representation, and fostering cross-cultural understanding. She is based in Fremont, California. And with that, let's welcome our panelists, and let's dive in.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Great start to this morning. Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to welcome you all here to this opening session of the South Asian Literature and Art Festival 2025 in this beautiful campus at Menlo College. Today I have with me a panel of 3 brilliant curators who are bringing new and fresh perspectives on how we see and experience South Asian art. And through our conversation, today we will dive into the power of curating and storytelling in bringing visibility to South Asian artists. And I see a number of our artists here in the audience today, so thank you for showing up. It is my honor to introduce the curators. First is Nidhi Gandhi. She is the curator of California art at the Oakland Museum of California. She holds an MA in art history from Williams College and a BA, guess, in neuroscience from Pomona College. Her research and projects draw attention to vernacular art, place-based practices, and diasporic histories and presence. She has previously held curatorial roles at the San Jose Museum of Art, the Benton Museum of Art at Pomona College, the Clark Art Institute, and the Brooklyn Museum as the 2021 Art Table Fellow. Our next panelist is Dr. Padma Dorje Maitland. He is the Malavali Family Foundation Associate Curator Art of the Indian Subcontinent at the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco. He holds dual doctoral degrees in architectural history and South Asian studies from UC Berkeley, and an MArch, a Master of Architecture, from Princeton. His research focuses on the art and architecture of modern Buddhist movements in India and the history of emotions. He has curated shows at BAMPFA, LACMA, Minneapolis Institute of Art, and the Asian Art Museum, including the show Jitish Kalat, covering letter Geranium Nuncius, which opens next week. His publications include the recently released edited volume, Art, Hope, Action, Creative Praxis in Pandemic Times. And our third panelist is Tausif Noor. He is a critic, curatorial associate at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, and a PhD candidate in history of art at UC Berkeley. His research and curating addresses nationalism and internationalism, and his writing appears in the New Yorker and the New York Review of Books, among other periodicals, as well as in various catalogs and edited volumes. Wow, congratulations. You have achieved so much at such a young age. So, now, behind all these accomplishments, amazing accomplishments that you have, I'm sure there is a very interesting backstory to it. Because becoming a curator is very often this very windy road. It is not a linear path. It is full of unexpected twists and turns. Something like what you can call a scenic highway route, like Highway 1, compared to the Highway 5, which can be a straight linear one. So I'd love to ask each one of you a little bit about your personal journeys, where you were born, your education, and what drew you to curating. And also if you all had to face family pressure, which, the expectations of being the doctor, lawyer, engineer, the Trimurti of family expectations that many South Asians can relate to. So I'd like to start with you, Nidhi, if you can open this conversation and share a bit about your personal.
Of course, and I think that, as you can tell, I have a bachelor's in neuroscience, so already that might cue you into my journey being quite unusual, and yet I think, as you say, no one's journey to becoming an art curator is particularly linear or standard. So I grew up here. I grew up in Cupertino, born in Santa Clara, went to high school in South Bay, and very much had, I think, a story that is very familiar to all of you who have spent years and years here. My mother is a doctor, my father's an engineer, my brother's a doctor, his wife is a doctor. And I think that as a child, I also thought I wanted to be a doctor. And that transitioned slowly into wanting to become a psychologist and then become a neuroscientist. And then something strange happened, which is that I found out about a program at Brown and Rhode Island School of Design that's a dual degree. And my art teacher encouraged me to apply. And I was like, well, I think I have a good chance of getting into Brown, but no chance at all of getting into RISD. And then I didn't get into Brown and I got into RISD. And that really threw me for a loop. So then I started thinking, oh, maybe there are opportunities for me to engage in the arts and think about why that's important to me and what I can do with a career in the arts. So this really scared my parents. a lot. And they said, you've talked about doing a neuroscience degree for years. Why don't you go do that? And if by the end of it you still feel the arts are really pulling on you, we will support you fully. So I did my neuroscience degree. I focused on child development, and I started working in museums and museum education. And as you see the slides going, you'll see a very, I look very young now, I'm sure, but an even younger photo of me running education programs. And through that work, working in arts education programs that was aligned with my focus in child development in my neuroscience degree, I actually was given the opportunity to curate an exhibition on neuroaesthetics and the way in which we can interpret abstract art through a neuroscientific lens. And that was at my college, Pomona College. And after I did that, the staff at the museum said, hey, you're very good at this. Have you considered becoming a curator? And I was like, no way. No way. But the more I sat on it, the more I really loved the things you do as a curator. You're connecting a large group of people to art. You're giving them the language to connect to artwork and find something that resonates with themselves. And that really was underlined in my experience working with children and working with youth and connecting them to art, giving them tours, helping them build out lesson plans, making their own art in response. So that's really how I started on this journey. And then, it's all just long and short of it is here I am at that point. Shall I hand it off?
Yeah, I think that might be easier.
Great, well, it's wonderful to be here, and this is a conversation we've wanted to have for a long time together. It's unusual to have so many curators in one area who focus directly or indirectly on South Asia in their practice. Curatorial journey, yeah, it was not a real profession when I started as a kid. I remember I had an uncle-in-law who was a curator, and I thought, what does he do all day? All the art is on the wall already. And then here we are, and I find myself super busy for some reason, and the art is still on the wall. But there we are. I guess there's two parts. I grew up in a Buddhist community, and because of that I ended up going to India quite young for school and then work. So I share that both for my focus on South Asia, but also for my pathway to kind of curatorial practice. I studied architecture. I loved architecture. I liked the design, and I had in mind to kind of go be like a New York white box architect. So I ended up at Princeton, and I almost failed. I almost failed because I started curating my architectural projects, and the professors hated that. I did not get the positive encouragement that Nidhi got. I got, again, low pass. But I loved it. But at the same time, I started doing conservation work in Nepal on the Swayambhu temple. And I was the assistant art director there, and my job was to kind of document the process of removing and restoring the pieces, but also to study the history and figure out how to promote that history through programs and events for the public and with the government. And so I ended up doing a small exhibition at the Padma Museum there on the craftsmen and the kind of long history of working at that site. And then I came back to Berkeley, and a very similar story. A curator came up to me and said, hey, do you want to write a label? It was actually for the Berkeley Art Museum. And I was like, yes, I want to write a label. And it took me 3 months and 25 books to write 150 words, but I loved it. And it was such a nice process of discovering. I guess I struggle with writing too. If somebody asked me to write a book, nobody has asked me to do that, but if somebody did, the daunting task of writing a huge book or a huge kind of definitive topic, I found very overwhelming. But to write in conversation with the work of art, I found really meaningful, both for how I got to explore it, but also the kind of way you got to engage with it. And over time, that's become more of a dialogue with artists, and I think I like that process of working and thinking through a history, a work of art with artists, with that work of art itself. And so I think that's where I am today.
Thank you, Padma. And thank you all for being here. Thank you to Sala and Artforum SF for bringing us together. Like Padma said, that we all live in the Bay, but it's hard to get us all in the same room because we are so busy. But thank you also for sharing your stories. So I was born in Dhaka. I moved to the US when I was about 4.5 years old. I grew up in New York City. And, I come from, a background where we didn't actually have many professional people in my family. And I think it was certainly my parents' dream that I become Dr. Anjali or Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, something like that. But I think when I went to college, I went to Dartmouth College for undergrad, and I studied art history, which was a total shock to my parents because I had told them that I would study law and become a diplomat or something like that. And that didn't happen. I did end up minoring in government, which was very meaningful to me and has shaped how I think about art. But I majored in art history. My parents nearly had a heart attack. After I graduated from undergrad, I actually lived in India on a Fulbright scholarship, and I was working at biennials and working at the Kochi Biennial. I worked at the Dara Gallery in Delhi. I did a lot of amazing things, and I just realized I loved working with artists and working with art, and it was very meaningful. But when I came back to the US, this was in 2015, I applied for jobs in New York and internships, and I didn't get a single one at a museum or gallery. So I actually ended up working in management consulting for a year in Washington, D.C., and I hated it. And I left, and I did a master's degree in London in a program that no longer exists at Goldsmiths called Art and Politics. And all the while that I was working at on my MA, I was writing. And I think of myself primarily as a writer to this day, even though I am a curator. I believe that, the way I got here, talk about a winding road, was through like a lot of different freelance jobs and writing jobs and cobbling things together. And it still kind of feels like that. So I did my master's, and then I got an internship after at the Whitney Museum in New York. From that turned into a fellowship at the ICA Philadelphia. And I worked in programming and education, but also in a kind of curatorial role, wearing many hats. But I realized that I wanted to dig deeper, and I wanted to dig deeper and have the time and space to do research on specifically art from East Pakistan and Bangladesh. Growing up, I had a very strong connection to my heritage. My mom is a classically trained singer. I did theater growing up for many years, so I would go to a lot of cultural events, and I wanted to have the time and space to dig deeper. So I enrolled in the PhD program at Berkeley, and then the pandemic hit. So my entire first year was remote and on Zoom, and I kept writing, and even when I moved here, I kept writing and doing projects, curatorial projects with students. And eventually I've decided, alongside my dissertation research, I now have a full-time role at the Berkeley Art Museum, where I work on collections-based work as well as solo presentations of artists. So it is, I think, there was no set path, and there was no real model for me. So I had to create that on my own, doing the things that I know that I like to do and that I was good at, which largely was writing.
So thank you everyone for sharing a bit of your personal journeys. Padme, I think hearing about your journey through architecture, history, literature, film, curation, I think it's so reflective of the theme of this festival today, which is Thoughts Without Borders. And even your name, I think, breaks boundaries. Thank you, Nidhi and Tausif, for sharing your journeys. And I'm so glad that Scenic Crowd brought you here to the Bay Area. where we all will get to see the work and be with you in your journeys as you move forward. Now, moving on to the second round of questions, which relates to the curatorial practices that each of you follow. And Nidhi will again begin with you. The Oakland Museum of California isn't the first place you think of when you think of South Asian art. And yet, South Asian communities have been a vital part of California's history as well as culture. For example, the Sikh and the Punjabi communities have a history dating back to the early 1900s or even the late 1800s. And then on the East Coast, you have Bengali Harlem. Their legacies are there. And there must be many other South Asian communities whose histories are not so well documented as such. So my question to you is, what has been your experience in encountering these stories within your museum's narrative? Do you find them well integrated, or are they still kind of like set apart from the main story?
Yeah, I think that, it's interesting because you'll hear each of the three of us kind of approach storytelling, especially the way storytelling intersects with identity in quite different ways. For me, I didn't realize both of you have spent such substantial time outside of the States, especially growing up, and that really does shape your sense of how you tell stories and how you integrate stories too. I think for me, growing up here and really, understanding myself as an Indian American, child of immigrants, and going into museums, I always wanted to see these stories of South Asian people as interwoven with the fabric of an American story and a California story. I think that there is no, California or America without South Asians. And as we know, hopefully everyone knows that South Asians are the fastest growing population in California, and has been for the last 10 years. So I think that, when I think about my curatorial projects and the work that I choose to do, I am always looking for ways in which South Asian artists and South Asian people are using the specific cultural lens that we bring to speak to larger questions of identity, conflict, economics, politics that shape the community that we live in. To me, I'm very much have always been a curator that thinks about who is here right now. Who is coming through my gallery right now, and what do they need to see to change something that they're thinking about who they are and where they live and who they live among. So I think that previously I've often worked in contemporary and modern spaces, and so when you're thinking about that, one example is my current show, Young Bay Mud, where I have 5 artists. One of them happens to be an Indian artist who is thinking about the ways in which her background brings in this specific relationality to the land that she has come to live on here in the Bay. And the ways in which her particular relationship with, maybe it's Hinduism, maybe it's spirituality, her background with land speaks to kind of different way of seeing the land. So I hope that people who are South Asian not only come and say, hey, not only do I have a point of insertion into this broader narrative of different ways people relate to land, but then folks who are not South Asian look at that and find some resonance with the way they can relate to land differently, and they can learn something from us as well. So it's really about not only seeing yourself in it, but building a sense of a network and community. At the Oakland Museum, it's very interesting because I think that as most museums that do not specialize have found themselves, having to kind of piecemeal match the diversity of their community over the last 15, 20 years. There's been a real realization of how little their collecting practices and exhibition practices have actually reflected the demographics of who is here. Nonetheless, at the Oakland Museum, we have many objects that reflect the history of the Punjabi Mexican community that has established many of the agricultural practices that are now standardized throughout this state. There's great representation from modern and contemporary artists. Well, I shouldn't say great. There is good representation, some representation that certainly could be built on and nuanced. But I am trying to look at the ways in which those stories can not, we don't just tell those stories for what they are, but that anyone can see some reflection of themselves in those stories.
Oh, sorry. You can just talk about that.
Thank you, Nidhi. I think in one of the photographs in the presentation, you have included a photograph, an archival of a Sikh farmer from the early 1980s. Right here, yeah, tilling asparagus fields. One question to you, Nidhi, is in your bio, it was you were the curator of California art. What does that term specifically mean? Does the museum have like a kind of a definition for it, or how do they explain it?
Yes, so the museum is the Museum of California, and so everything we do is about telling the story of California. It's very different from maybe any museum that exists in the United States otherwise. We don't, especially because it's a museum that covers the natural sciences, history, and art. So I specifically am looking at artists, artistic practices, stretching from pre-settler life in California, so indigenous people to California and their creative practices, all the way to contemporary art, focusing very particularly on the region of California. And so it's a broad time period, but actually a very specific geographic space. And I think in some ways an identity too, because I think that anyone who moves here, and I certainly have found this over time, I've spent a lot of time working in California, and I have found that more than being I identify as a woman, I identify as an Indian American, as a daughter of immigrants. I have consistently found myself feeling some affinity and alignment to what it is to be a Californian. There's some kind of specific thing to being here and living in this state. Even when you go globally across the world, people have a sense of what California is. They know what California is. So that's kind of where I focus my attention. And it's been a very unique opportunity for me to be able to think about community and what it means to be part of this community and what the story of this community is in terms of this region, as opposed to maybe some other identity marker.
As they would say in Punjabi, shabash putter. Yeah. So, Padma, through your curatorial initiative, the Asian Art Museum has recently acquired many pieces from South Asian artists. There is Gurjeet Singh's When Words Hurt. There is an ongoing display of Vikrant Bise's Dalit Panthers and the recently concluded Project Dastan. They all have brought important visibility and representation to South Asian art. Can you share why you selected these artists and what are the themes, the stories, or even tensions, if you might say, that you see emerging vividly, which museums could and maybe should include in their narratives?
That's a big question. But first, I just want to say I was so excited when Nidhi was appointed as the curator of California in Oakland, particularly because I think it says that South Asian histories and kind of more globally are a part of California histories, and so I'm excited to see that kind of work. And just the shows that you all are doing are fantastic. So, okay, so curatorial strategy. So the Asian Art Museum is an interesting place. It has this kind of older history, and I always kind of remember walking in after I'd started the job, and it was almost as if South Asia had no present. It stopped at like the 1400s. Not to say there was nothing. It just like that's where the narrative stopped, and so that's felt wrong, right? South Asia is vibrant and alive, and even here in California too, right? Like there's history. So part of the acquisition strategy is first and foremost just to crack that open, to say that there's vibrant, dynamic art from after the 1400s that is part of an ongoing dialogue, but also to say that the community engagement is also vibrant and there. And so trying to find ways to crack that open in a way that also engages with the museum's unique history and its site and its mission to present South Asian and Asian American perspectives. I like the idea that audiences will come and see themselves in some ways or see themselves engage. So I think Gurjeet Singh's teary eyes and pricky words, which make up a mini exhibition called When Words Hurt, is an interesting example. First, the kind of Sikh gallery is one of the first galleries dedicated to Sikh art, and I like it also because Dr. Kapani was an early pioneer of fiber optics. And so this is also the history of Silicon Valley, right? And so understanding that that's also embedded in the Asian Art Museum's history, or understanding that that's part of South Asian art, I think is also important. So Gurjeet Singh, it's this wonderful plushy animal that's all about like soft sculpture that really takes on this idea of identity, and it asks the audience to say, how do you feel when you look at art, right? And so on one level, it's just immediately, viscerally grabs you. And I thought it would grab people of all ages, means I think kids would really enjoy it. And there's this really kind of non-verbal engagement with it. In my label for it, I told you I like writing labels. I ended up using emojis because I felt it was like a sculptural emoji. It says, I'm having feelings, do you have feelings too? Gurjeet Singh's practice also takes on questions of queer identity, Punjabi identity, all of these things, and asks how those exist alongside a Sikh identity. And I thought that was particularly important to bring into the Sikh gallery, for example. I'm kind of just running through a few, I hope that's okay. Vikrant Bise's Dalit Panthers, or archival historicity Dalit Panthers, is another example of trying to find a link between artists practicing in Mumbai and the history of California and Berkeley. It happens to also match up with my research, so I was particularly glad about that. But again, this in 1970s, the Dalit Panthers forms in Mumbai, ideologically aligning himself with the Black Panthers in California. So understanding those historical links in architecture, I think in art is really important and has actually been really profound to audiences as they come in. So it's not the Asian Art Museum, Asian art somewhere out there, but actually Asian art is part of a much more global and kind of interconnected history. The third, and I'll talk because Ashwini Bhatt's What Will It Take for Us to Make is another work that kind of signaled a shift in our museum's mission from Asian to Asian American. Hey, there it is. Really thinking about how we start to understand those histories in conversation through ideas, through works that reference historical in traditional elements, say the temple bell or ringing, but then bring it together with more local history, say the calla lily motif or the wildfires that are here, and understanding how those might sit together. There's some tension, and those are just 3 works we're acquiring more and more. I think I see acquisitions as one area I can start to have a kind of say in what kind of narratives we can bring into the museum. So super excited to keep doing that. But I would say that's a collective project, and I really see my role more and more as bringing together partners and voices rather than kind of driving a single vision around it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned also about Ashwini's piece. It's a beautiful piece. I encourage all of you to go to the museum and check out her work as well as all the other works that Padma has talked about and shown you here as well. And so, Tausif, your turn. You've been part of many exhibitions. You've contributed critical essays for catalogs, and most recently you co-curated to exalt the ephemeral, the impermanent collection. Can you talk about some of the pieces that stood out for you in your work, which helped to amplify South Asian voices? And also, if you could talk about, how do you perceive this current moment for South Asian art, especially across the diaspora? And Padma also mentioned about, these emerging, the vibrancy of South Asian art and the tensions that are emerging. So a few thoughts on those as well.
Yes, thank you so much. So hopefully I will also have the kind of synchronicity that will allow those works to emerge. So I guess one thing that I maybe perhaps differ in my curatorial approach is that I'm kind of unconcerned with identity as a category, and I'm very much to Exalt the Ephemeral, which is the first exhibition I co-curated at the Berkeley Art Museum, was a thematic exhibition. And I'm interested in those kinds of group shows. I'm interested broadly in my own research and writing and curating on art that is modern and contemporary, but that has a specific relationship and awareness of history. I'm always interested in how artists interpret history. To Exalt the Ephemeral, the broad sort of gambit was to look at the Berkeley Art Museum's permanent collection and think about themes of ephemerality. And I divided that show into several different parts on materiality, on environment and atmosphere was a main theme, and that's where I was able to show some works from the Jean and Francis Marshall collection. So there are two Ragmala paintings. And what I was able to sort of identify in these paintings was this kind of interest in the heavenly, the spiritual. So there's an image of Krishna and the gopis, there's a kind of Bashanta Ragini. So I was thinking about the sort of ephemerality of our time here on Earth and something like another realm that could exist vis-a-vis, and these works felt naturally kind of included in that. And that's kind of how my approach to curating is, and my understanding of modern contemporary South Asian art, which is that this has always been part of a larger international dialogue. These borders that we talk about between nations and these groups and identities, they're fairly recent things. So if we can sort of, there have been sort of right-wing movements that say, in this kind of nationalist form of nostalgia, that, this is how our story was and has been going back to X year. That story is also a story about connection. So I think it's important for me as kind of, from my own political orientations to the way that I work, to emphasize those connections rather than the divisions. So much in the same way that Nidhi was talking about that South Asians have been part of the American story, I would say that South Asians are part of a global and international story. And that's what I hope to emphasize. So in terms of what you inquired about regarding current trends in South Asian art, I'm always drawn to those artists who, in their work and in their life stories perhaps, are attuned to that kind of interconnection. I really, as someone I'm from Bangladesh, so that region has been the subject of many divisions from the partition 1905 to 47 to 71. But I also think that even as those partitions have shaped the story of Bangladesh, that story has also been shaped by artists who travel abroad, who study abroad. My own dissertation project examines East Pakistani and Bangladeshi artists who were trained in Paris and Italy and Japan and went back to Bangladesh and brought all the things that they knew there. To me, it's important to emphasize those kinds of things, and I think the sort of current trends in South Asian art, both of South Asian artists living in South Asia and those from the diaspora, I do think I see more and am excited by artists who kind of emphasize those kinds of connections.
Sorry, as you two were speaking, I realized I need to give a little credit of the show I was speaking about that I curated, Young Bay Mud, is at the San Jose Museum of Art where I worked previously, and the artist I was speaking about is Ashwini Bhatt, who Padma also talked about. So I just wanted to say that because I realized I never said her name, which is completely rude. It's a beautiful set of works that everyone should see.
Thank you, Nidhi. Thank you, everyone. So that was just beautiful, and I'm sure you all also enjoyed that. And now we come to something which I'm very experienced personally, because I personally came into curation very organically. So I think of myself as a member of the audience and sometimes a curator. And I'm reminded of something a friend once told me after visiting an art exhibition. He said, "I loved the art, but I did not understand a word of what was on the wall labels." And that made me realize that the way we talk about art can itself create or dissolve borders. So whether it is scholarly vocabulary or very art historical specific terms, or even the choice of what language appears on the wall can kind of determine who feels invited into the conversation. So my next question is around language and access. Nidhi, how can curators present South Asian art, especially for our diasporic communities who may not have encountered this or may be encountering these works for the first time? Because at the end of the day, we are all, you, me, and our audiences are trying to grow this tent.
Yes, I think also, the position I'm in too, and we all experience, there's people of all walks of life walking through these galleries and with different levels of fluency with art making, with South Asian traditions, with other traditions. I have a very distinct memory of dragging my parents to SF MoMA in high school and standing them in front of a Mark Rothko piece and trying to explain to them why this work that was pretty much entirely red paint mattered at all. And I think that, an instance was really what shaped, in large part, my understanding of what anyone coming into a art museum, gallery, looking at art in general, is experiencing and what the barriers to access are. So more so than worrying about identity, because I also have, in my role, have to be able to speak to anyone's experience and any artist's messaging too. But more than being concerned with any particular person, not being able to understand what's on the wall, I think very much in how universal language can be and how to best give access points that are entryways. The thing is, you're just not gonna, you have 150 words, you're not going to speak to everyone or say everything. And so a lot of times I have to have faith in the audience coming in, that they will see something that matters to them, but my role is to give the nudges that I can to open their eyes and to start thinking for themselves. I think a lot of the times when people say, oh, they go into a gallery and they say, I don't understand, or I didn't connect with that, I didn't love that. A lot of the times what's actually happening is that they're having a fear-based response to something new. And they're having a fear-based response to being seen as less than, or less smart, or less knowledgeable. And so rather than opening up to that exploratory space, that space of curiosity and not knowing that I think we all had at one stage when we were children, they put up this barrier of saying, I'm not going to understand that because there is a problem there. And so to me, my role is about making space for people to sit in that discomfort of not knowing and finding their own connection to it and realizing that that is just as valid as anything that I can say or anything that the artist says, because once it's in a museum, it's for everyone. And artists might hate to hear this, but that is the reality, is that the whole point is that we're creating a society that anyone can, that betters all of us, regardless of what, they might be, they're hopefully bringing themselves to it, and that might be different from what you are, but it's just as valid, and it's just as important.
Thank you. We just pass the mic around if we have just a few more minutes to wrap up.
So, access is a hard one, and it's kind of, there's just systematic issues around it. I'm glad to see our museum is starting to ramp up education programs that bring in audiences younger, and language is, of course, another. As you were talking, I sometimes teach art history courses, and I've had classes where I've asked students not to respond in word, like legible sounds, but just in sounds. How does that painting make you feel in a sound? And I have to give a shout out for this afternoon. We'll have a conversation with Meetu Sen, who will be presenting her work. Language, of course, will be a big part of that, so I think we'll come back, so I hope you all can join for that. Just one example, because this is also my duty as a curator. We have Jidish Kalat show opening, covering letter Terna Nuncius, and I think it actually speaks to what we're talking about. The work takes off from a set of images and sounds that were sent into space in 1977 of Boyd Forager, and now brings it back and brings them into the gallery. Those sets of images and words of welcome in 55 languages. And it asks us to kind of step into this, what might an extraterrestrial, what might this other understand human Earth from this kind of message that was sent into space? And it throws us into that. A kind of small decision was to put the didactic materials behind you when you enter the gallery. So you actually have to encounter the work first and kind of find yourself in that space before finding the text that explains it. And so hopefully that will encourage people to walk into that moment of ambiguity and find some kind of comfort/discomfort in that, and then maybe make their own readings first.
Yes, working in museums, I'm just going to echo what both Nidhi and Padma said, that we do want to make this welcoming to people, make the space welcoming to people. But also, just to echo what Padma said, writing 150 words to sum up a work of art is very difficult. I write, and I think this has helped me a lot, I write in a lot of different modes. So I write in an academic mode for journal articles. I write in a specialist art mode for specialist art magazines. And I write in a very journalistic mode for, the New York Times or something like that, where I am not, supposed to use jargon. That has definitely helped me kind of understand that there are different modes of writing and different modes of audience. One caveat I will say is that it's interesting to me that art has this unique sort of responsibility, or art museums have this unique responsibility to not use specialized jargon, quote unquote, given that a business person, a scientist, is not obligated to do the same, even though ostensibly those are also really important public-facing fields. So one of my kind of main sort of mantras is that I don't believe in reducing and simplifying the aim of an artwork or its mission or the artist's intention just to serve some sort of naive universalism. I do think that it's important for me to present ideas in their full complexity. Now, the language in which that happens can be, made more accessible, but I don't take for granted the idea that my audience is uneducated or incapable of understanding these things. That said, there are a lot of, as Padma mentioned, systematic kind of rules and regulations on how museum labels and materials work, but as a writer and someone who identifies primarily as a writer, I think it's important to think about the different modes and think about what writing does, because it's an active thing. As someone who also teaches undergrads, something I always tell my students, and I was told, many, many years ago, and it stayed with me, is people are very quick to go into a museum and ask, what does this mean? And I think that's a very kind of wrong approach. I think the way that one should approach art, and this is how I was taught, is just start by asking what the work is doing. Use description, color, line, all of those things are a great way to start toward approaching meaning. And I think when you kind of understand that, and that's something I tell our museum educators and when I give tours, once you start with that understanding and meaning come more naturally than you would think.
Thank you. I think our conversation was just about getting started now, but we are out of time, so we have to end it here. We have time for a few questions from the audience, if anybody would like to ask anything. Do we have a mic to give to the audience? That's fine.
I can just speak loud.
Oh, sure, Moses.
It's in response to what Nidhi brought up about once you put a work out in the museum, it's for everyone. But I also wondered, most museums are, because of the price tag, are exclusive places, so it's not very fair to say that it's for everyone. Of course, most museums do have free days, but those are rare, and I know the school trips help educate kids at breaks and everything. But that's a very small drop in the ocean kind of thing. The way our world is set up in the contemporary modern world, the art is not for everyone. It is really people who can if you're growing up in, let's say, Fremont, somebody has to commute all the way. And it may not even occur to people who for their entire life that, hey, we should go to San Francisco instead of going to Chinatown, we should go to MoMA. So, these problems are kind of inbuilt in our modern day life. And it's not a question, but I just wanted to point that out, that should always be in the thinking.
Thank you, Moaz. Anybody else?
Wait, I just want to quickly say yes, absolutely. And I think anyone who works in museums feels this very deeply and strongly right now, especially. And I want to point out too that museums are nonprofits. The government has stopped funding the arts. Philanthropy is dying. And the onus, as often happens in this country, is taken up by our least, our most at-risk populations in many ways. The Oakland Museum has specifically not only waived the cost of school tours, but also is now offering free bus services for Title I schools. So there are ways in which museums are trying, right? But if you really care about free admission, you can always donate if you have extra money, because that is what allows other people who do not have that money to access our arts.
You tell them.
Thank you, Nidhi. I think also we should have a panel for museum directors as well and bring these points to them. Yes. Second question.
Well, actually, two quick comments and one question to Tausif. The comment is, in a typical museum setting, I've been around the museum block a few times now, somebody pauses in front of a work of art for less than 20 seconds. That's the number, okay? So what you have on the label does not really matter unless the label is made accessible in a non-print format for the audience. Museums have to face that reality, number one. Number two, which is, a comment for Padma, is a thank you for bringing or helping bring the Asian, for South Asia, into after the discovery of America. So good news. But the question is really for Tausif, and that is, you situated identity as separate from art, and I love that, right? An artist is an artist. It's not an Indian artist, a South Asian artist, a Pakistani artist. It really doesn't matter, right? How do you feel? And artists themselves would love to be viewed as such, right? How do you fit that thought, that idea into the present?
Yes, thank you so much, Nidhi, for bringing that up, because I think that in a very well-intentioned effort to increase diversity, equity, inclusion, which, those initiatives are going out the window under this regime, there has been or had been in recent years this kind of emphasis on identity. And I find that, again, as well-intentioned as that may be, it ends up kind of, quite frankly, ghettoizing artists and also emphasizing that above their work. Now, the artists that I'm drawn to and and really admire and really try to show are those artists for whom identity is not some kind of forefronted thing, but it's baked into the work themselves. You read the work and you can understand aspects of identity from that, but it's about the work first. And I think, as you said, about this current moment, I think artists, again, those that I am in dialogue with, those that I try to champion, the ones that are really both, advancing representation from our region and others in a very white dominant field still to this day, are those who are able to do that dynamically. Identity is not some sort of fixed thing. It's something that's in flux. So the work, and this is what art can do, right? Art is something that exists outside. It's funny, I studied politics and everything. Art is something that is informed by the political and the social, but it's also something that can supersede it. And I think the work that I'm most attracted to and the practices that I try to really forefront are those that kind of take that as the starting point of their practice.
So maybe have one more question.
First of all, very interesting presentations. My question is, museums acquire art. How does a curator relate to that process? Or do they have any role in it?
Okay, sure. It's a very bureaucratic process, but the curator is often responsible for championing it through. So they kind of drive it. They often take a lead in identifying the work, selecting which one, and then making a pretty robust case for why it matters for the collection. For the Asian Art Museum, for example, the collection is actually the property of the city of San Francisco. So you also have to make an explanation of why you think this work particularly is of value for the city and more broadly the Bay Area as part of a larger presentation. So it's actually, I think it's a really fascinating process because you have to make these really robust discussions about what will distinguish it from other museums, why it needs to be in the collection, and all of those things.
I'd also like to say that, collections are often shaped by curators through their acquisitions process. So when I did To Exalt the Ephemeral, I was telling, a thematic story about ephemerality as it's, seen in visual art, but I was also telling a story about the Berkeley Art Museum and the kinds of art that it collected from its foundation in the 1970s, which was largely conceptual, non-object-based work, ephemeral work, performance. So every curator, myself included, tries to leave their fingerprint on the collection in some way vis-a-vis acquisition.
To follow up, do curators influence trends? Because if you select a certain art forms and certain artists, you are really telling the artist community that this is what is preferred. This happened in Paris, I think, when the Picasso and the other people, they formed a separate, entity to counteract these museums who were just displaying art of a particular time. So, do curators influence trends?
Actually, I think that's a great example of how little power curators have to influence trends, and how little often artists who are making the most historically relevant, interesting, complicated work are the ones who are counteracting and working against institutions like museums. I would also say that, it's complicated. Are you talking about the art market, which has its own trends and own, influences? Are you talking about, the kind of education community, which has its own, power players and people? And there's been phases where the government has funded more or less of the art being made, and the WPA programs post World War II, for example, led to a huge boom in mural making in this country. So there's ways in which yes and no. I do think I would just say, for me personally, I've actually found that yes, curators are important in proposing works, but not to harp on funding, but it all depends on our acquisitions fund. And not every museum has a substantial acquisitions fund. And as well, at the Oakland Museum, we have a much more democratic process maybe, where curators do submit proposals, but there are several committees that weigh in on whether this is going to be a work that they can bring in and should bring in. So it differs by institution as well.
Thank you. We have to be respectful of the time. I'm sorry. we have to now wrap it up. Thank you, Nidhi, Padma, and Tausif for your thoughtful insights. What we heard today was that curating is more than just being about exhibitions. It's about storytelling, it's about access and representation. Thank you to our audience for being here today, and may we continue to widen the tent. And also a big thank you to Sala and the team for this wonderful festival. Enjoy your day.